I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about, or just mention a little bit about the New Economics Foundation. As you've probably heard, our name mentioned a few times already today. We're an independent think and do tank based in London, and we're inspired by three principles, which is sustainable development, social justice, and people's well-being. And we've been working alongside the New Economics Institute for the last sort of year and a half, I suppose, and yeah, hopefully continue working with them. It's very exciting that that they've sort of developed into the organisation that they are. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the challenge about linking human security to energy security. The first of which is sustainable energy for all. So currently, about 1.4 billion people in the world have no access to electricity. There's also a further 2.7 billion people that also rely on traditional biomass for cooking and heating as their primary source of energy. So there's lots of health implications to do with that. There's lots of time implications, time to gather the biomass, the fact that they often have many health problems from the smoke produced by sort of quite poor quality biomass. And there's also kind of local environmental problems related to that, whether it's local deforestation. So that's one issue. By 2030, the International Energy Agency projects that there will be around about a further 1.4 billion people who will be at risk of not having access to energy services, so primarily electricity. And there's a lot of human development implications for that, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail next. Secondly, there's this idea of unburnable carbon, or the climate change problem. We know that we already have more carbon reserves proven and listed on stock exchanges around the world than we can actually burn if we have any intention of staying below 2 degrees. So, and also the worst thing about the unburnable carbon problem is that finance, funding, capital is still flowing into fossil fuel investments. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is about why that's continuing to happen, what are the barriers about that, and how we can do something to stop that. Because clearly, despite what we all know about climate change, there's something in the financial system that's wrong because it's telling investors that actually it's still profitable to be investing in this stuff. And then the other problem is, of course, peak oil and energy speculation. The recent rise in oil prices, which began sort of around about 2006, 2007, really was the precursor of the credit crisis. It was something that was ready to happen, but that was one of the real drivers that caused the financial crisis in 2008, due to the price of oil rising and basically eating into household budgets, which resulted in the defaulting on mortgages and so on. So how do we deal with this kind of rising oil prices, increase in volatility, the fact that a lot of fossil fuel reserves, particularly oil, are located in very sort of geopolitically tense regions, and there's a lot of nasty politics and governance issues going around alongside oil as well. So it's another reason why we should be weaning ourselves off the nasty fossil fuels. So the challenge basically leads us to believe that there needs to be an unprecedented transformation of the world's energy systems. So the solution: first of all, enable access to sustainable modern energy systems for all, and to put appropriate solutions at the centre. Because, like I said, there's a huge proportion of the population, global population, about 1 in 5, who have no access to electricity at all. And it's almost incomprehensible for us to imagine what it's like without electricity unless you go camping for a weekend, really. And, you know, it has a huge impact. So, but the problem, alongside that solution of providing electricity to those who don't have it, is the fact that it has to be affordable. Because one of the problems is not actually that we don't have electricity, we don't have the technologies to deliver electricity to everyone. It's the fact that actually a lot of people cannot afford it. And there's reasons for that, whether it's there aren't sustainable models for delivering that electricity. Affordability is often related to privatisation of electricity systems. Then secondly, ownership. So appropriate ownership models of electricity systems or energy systems are essential in determining whether communities benefit the full value of that energy system. In the UK, for example, there's a lot of problems, a lot of issues with NIMBYism, not in my backyard, regarding onshore wind turbines. And most of that is actually driven by the fact that those communities have not been involved in the decision-making process. And often, the scale is inappropriate as well. So if communities are involved in the ownership of those systems, they are getting some benefit out of it. And also, the level of engagement of the user group, so whether those communities actually are involved in deciding what's useful for that community. So making decisions, energy decisions based on the locale. Thirdly, decentralized energy systems. So they're much easier to install, much quicker than building sort of huge, large coal-fired power stations, and also maintaining a grid. I think Paul's going to talk a little bit about that later, but decentralized energy systems really are very competitive now price-wise, and particularly in developing countries where they are not, the grid infrastructure isn't already there. And plus, there's also many social, environmental, and economic benefits beyond just carbon related to decentralized energy systems in terms of, again, ownership, but also that there's lots of business opportunities, local economic benefits as well. And then finally, you also need to consider about the environmental, social costs and benefits of different types of energy systems. So hydropower, for example, can be problematic in some areas. It's not always appropriate to stick in a big dam somewhere. There's lots of debates about that and a lot of campaigns against World Bank finance of hydro as well because of the huge environmental damages it can have. Micro hydro, however, can be much more beneficial, but you need to balance the social, environmental and economic costs rather than just focusing on the economic, which is generally what we tend to do with energy at the moment. So in order to shift away or move towards sustainable energy for everyone, the real thing that we need to do is basically shift capital away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And this requires leadership at the international level, at the national level, and also at the local level. Regulation is key because a lot of the reasons why businesses are not responding to perhaps sort of changing environment and our concerns is that actually there's no incentive for them to do so. Carbon price is one example. Consumer investor activism. We carried out some research recently where we interviewed around about 20 leading experts in the sustainable energy sector. Investment sectors, they were sort of people who are working in pension funds, ethical pension funds, banks and so on. And one of their key things was saying, well, we actually don't ever, even though we know all these issues are, well, there isn't actually that much of a market for us. I mean, we are a very niche market, and the mainstream sector, which is still investing in, for example, fossil fuels, their CEO, probably a very intelligent person, probably understands the issues, but actually there isn't necessarily a call from their investors or consumers to change that behaviour. And obviously a no-brainer is the removal of fossil fuel subsidies, but the problem with this is that at the moment, a lot of developing countries, fossil fuel subsidies provide an important social need. Although the International Energy Agency has claimed that these kind of consumption-based fossil fuel subsidies often benefit the middle classes rather than the very poor. So there's a question about that. And again, there needs to be a lot more research in this area. And then finally, public sector finance. So providing, I suppose, reducing the risk of investing in renewable energies. And one thing might be the Green Investment Bank. The UK has just had a Green Investment Bank, which has got a lot of teething problems. At the moment, it actually can't lend money, so it's not really a bank. But the German, there's a very good example in Germany, the KfW, which is was set up after the Second World War to help sort of redesign and restructure Germany, and that then later in the sort of 1970s, during the oil crisis, started investing into energy efficiency, and now has created the enormous energy efficiency and renewable energy sector in Germany that it's famed for. So it can work as well. So human security. This is taken as a kind of a, we're taking the definition of human security as being human by well-being, really, which basically means a dynamic state in which the individual is able to develop their potential work productively and creatively build strong and positive relations with others, and contribute to their community. It's enhanced when an individual is able to fulfill their personal and social goals and achieve a sense of purpose in society. So that's our kind of overall definition of human security, which then, when you sort of break it down, links into the sort of key development indicators. So this graph here is just showing the relationship between the Human Development Index, and here is per capita energy consumption. So as you can see, there's a very sort of striking relationship between the Human Development Index and energy consumption that plateaus off, which is an interesting point which I'll come back to. But what that's telling you is that with very small increases in energy consumption or access to energy, you can have massive increases in development indicators. And just to break that down a little bit more, here we have two parts of the Human Development Index. We've got infant mortality, so it's showing that similar saturation curve. Along the bottom is energy consumption again. And this is life expectancy in years as well. So there's a very strong relationship between those two. Of course, I'm sure there's some statisticians that might have issues about correlation, causation, etc. But that's a very strong relationship, and there's a lot of reasons why you would expect that relationship to stand up. So unburnable carbon. So as I said, there's more carbon, fossil fuels, listed on the world's stock exchanges than we can actually burn. So what this is showing you here is this is the 2-degree carbon. So yeah, sorry, this is our remaining global carbon budget, and these are the global billions of tons of carbon dioxide from listed fossil fuel reserves. So there's also fossil reserves which are privately owned. So this is just those that are listed on stock exchanges. And what this is showing you is that there's more fossil fuels listed than you can burn. And this 2-degree target is based on a big study by a group of climate modellers in 2009. You may have come across it. It was published in Nature. It's a very big paper published by Malte Meinhausen. And so it's a fairly, published in Nature, top science journal, quite robust figures. So we had, I've been interviewing in the last sort of few months, investors and people working in that sector about what are these barriers to change? What are the key barriers to changing or sort of moving away from fossil fuel consumption or investment in fossil fuels to renewables? And the top one, which every single investor said, is the fact there's a lack of a long, loud and clear messages on climate change policy. So I'm sure it's just equally the same in the US as it is in the UK, where you have, with the political cycle, there's momentum that builds up around climate change policy or renewable energy policy, and then a new politician comes in and changes the rules of the game. And that policy uncertainty every single time wipes confidence away from investors, so they don't want to invest in renewable energy because it's too high risk, because of this chopping and changing. The lack of a carbon price, this herding mentality and short-termism. So herding mentality meaning that the same thing that causes speculative bubbles. Everyone, we're going to continue investing in fossil fuels because everyone else is. So, and we're just going to continue doing that because, if we sort of step out of line, then we're liable to be, if things go wrong, then it's obviously us to blame. So, and then short-termism as well, the fact that traders are working on their quarterly returns, whereas if you're holding a pension, you're thinking about your long-term investment interest, those sort of 20, 30 years. In terms of the planet, obviously we're thinking much longer than that, but that's not considered. So the decision maker is thinking about their 3-month quarterly bonuses and has no interest in sort of the long-term value and the impact that climate change might have on their assets. Climate denial is another one. I'm sure, again, it's something that we're all familiar with, but until there's a kind of consistent message about climate change, it's very difficult for people who aren't necessarily active in that sector to really know what to believe. And that's something that's really, really important. And accounting for the fact that climate carbon risk is just not included on balance sheets. There's a disconnect between shareholders and decision makers. So like I was saying, if you're a pension fund, if you're a pension holder, you might, your interest will be 30 years. You have passed that responsibility onto a pension fund trustee, who then passes that responsibility onto an investment manager. And there, again, that all the way down the decision-making tree, the interest becomes more and more short-term. And quite often, you know, when you're investing something, you're putting the decisions about your investment into the hands of someone else, who's not necessarily thinking about what your long-term interests are. Again, I think as I said that earlier, shareholders aren't asking enough questions about risk. There's an issue about carbon lock-in as well, so that's infrastructure, but it's also institutions and the kind of the social lock-in as well. So we've got sort of infrastructure that's very dependent on, or very high energy, very dependent on carbon oil, for example, transport, but also the institutions. So there's a lot of vested interests out there, whether it's you know, the big oil companies that are unwilling to change their business models. And then finally, it's the project and supply approach to energy policy. So rather than thinking, well, actually, how much energy is enough, quite often we are thinking about, you know, policy makers will look at, you know, make projections about how much they think energy consumption will grow over the next however many years, and they'll build their energy policy around that, rather than focusing on energy efficiency, energy conservation, and even ask those questions about actually how much is enough. The policy responses to this, well, political leadership, of course, that's something that's absolutely critical. A carbon price, some way of valuing carbon, or, you know, internalising the externality of carbon. Public sector finance, like I talked about, provides policy certainty. The global feed-in tariff is something that we are talking about at Rio in the next couple of weeks. And the idea of this is basically to provide subsidies for energy production. We've estimated, it's a group of organisations have estimated that it will cost about 100 billion a year for 10 to 15 years over that period. And by that time, projection is that renewable energies will become so much cheaper and much more competitive with fossil fuels. Now, 100 billion might sound like a lot, but it's worth remembering that the fossil fuel industry receives $550 billion a year. So it's only 1/5 of that. New accounting metrics, so asking companies to start looking at their environmental value at risk. So that would be looking at how much carbon you have on your balance sheet in terms of, you know, whether it's a fossil fuel asset, and how much of that would be at risk if, for example, carbon prices went up, and how much that would devalue the value of that asset. Disclosure and transparency. There's a big move towards social environmental governance within the sector. It's grown massively over the last few years. It's got a long way to go, but generally, companies that disclose and show corporate social responsibility tend to be a good proxy for management. So there's every reason why this should be reported. Encourage long-termism. You could do this by having loyalty dividends. So as an investor, if you were with a company for maybe more than 3 years, you would get a slightly higher return on your investment, which would encourage people to actually take a more active role in their investments. Again, we talked about fossil fuel subsidy reform, listing rules. So at the moment, in the UK, there are no rules about including climate change risk on your listing. So recently, Coal India listed a big investment on the London Stock Exchange. In the 500 pages of the document, not once were the words climate change mentioned, not in terms of the risk on the actual extraction of that coal, nor in terms of the actual production of carbon dioxide. And that's shocking that that can go through at this day and age. Rating agencies. So something like Moody's and Standard & Poor's, recently Moody's threatened to downgrade a German energy firm's credit rating if they went ahead and invested in nuclear power in the UK. And subsequently, that company pulled out. So that means that rating agencies could actually have a huge impact. And if they, again, if this kind of fed back into actually accounting for the potential carbon risk, then rating agencies could have a huge role to play. And then finally, bottom-up disruptions. So the role of grassroots organisations. There's a massive growing movement in the UK, and I'm sure in the US and globally as well, with communities starting to sort of have, you know, whether it's community-run energy systems. A colleague of mine one of my colleagues at NEF and I have just recently done a project evaluation for a community group in Cheshire, in sort of north of England, evaluating the effectiveness of their energy schemes recently, and it's very interesting that they're seeing this kind of large social environmental benefit, which they hadn't actually anticipated. They only went into it because there was the original carbon question, but now they're actually seeing the social and economic and environmental benefits beyond just the carbon. There's other issues, for example, peer-to-peer lending of money to support community-based projects. There was one organisation that's just recently set up in the UK, which is sort of crowdfunding for community energy projects. It took them about 5 years to actually get through all the loopholes of government in it for them to actually start the project. So that's another problem. It's about these bottom-up disruptions. They can be effective, but we really, really need to sort of focus on challenging governments and making those kind of policies, or those cutting red tape, really, to make it much easier for those sort of grassroots organisations to flourish. So effectively, our ultimate goal really is to live long and happy, fulfilling lives. And basically, this is our, the problem is that we have our inputs creating all these benefits, and it's actually not, at the moment, we're not being very efficient at creating the long and happy, fulfilling lives. This is my last slide. I don't want to hijack this whole section, but this is basically just showing the declining efficiency and levels of well-being, and this is at a European level. And what you see here is the ecological footprint. So it's your measure of energy, ecological consumption of goods, environmental goods. This is your happy life years, so it's a measure of well-being, and this is the efficiency. And as you can see, we are consuming more, our lives aren't getting that much happier, and so what we really need to do is improve this efficiency here. You can either reduce the efficiency or you can reduce your ecological footprint. So I think I'll just stop there because I'm sure we've have more discussion about this, but I'll pass over to Paul, who's going to talk a little bit more about the practical grassroots side of energy policy.
My name is Joyce Matunga. I'm a 33-year-old Zimbabwean woman, and I live in the northeastern highlands of Zimbabwe. Yesterday, I was out at dawn collecting firewood. I didn't come back until dark. If I had money, I'd buy wood, but I don't. So off I went with my 3 children, and I spent the day collecting about 30 kilograms of wood, which I brought home, carrying in bundles on my head. Yesterday was a good day. 30 kilograms is good, and it should last us about a week, as long as we manage it carefully. It's something I've always done, something I did with my mother, something I'm sure my children will do with their kids when they grow up. Somehow each year, that walk takes us a little bit longer. We seem to have to walk further and further as each year goes by. I burn the wood on a simple 3-stone stove that I cook our daily meal on. It's also the prime source of heat and light for our home in the cold evenings. It's also the cause of Ernest's eye infection, my son, and the prime source of my daughter Hope's cough, which ultimately killed her. At the time, I never knew that there was a problem. But frankly, even if I did know, I'm not sure I could do anything about it. I don't have a choice. Usually, I just cook 1 meal a day. I tend to choose foods that cook quickly so as to save that fuel and preserve it, which means that some of the more nutritious foods, like beans and maize, are out. I tend to choose porridge. It's quick, it's simple, it's filling. In the summer months, it gets hot. And when it gets hot, the food that I sell in the market goes off very quickly. So it means a lot of foods that I would otherwise sell, I can't sell. And so my ability to sell the kind of foods that would make me more money aren't there for me. If I had a fridge, I could do something. I could make money. The community clinic about 10 miles walk away, also has no fridge, which means it has no vaccines. It means the number of times that the lorry coming from the capital allows vaccines for kids is limited, once, maybe twice a year. There's no light either. So every time Labour comes around, and Labour tends to happen at night time, don't ask me why, you have to bring a candle to give birth by. There's no electric light. School's the same. No electric lights. No computers. It also means that when the kids come home from school, it means that as soon as it goes dark, there's no chance of doing homework. It means the small kerosene stove that I can sometimes buy kerosene for has not enough light to be able to read or do homework by. If we had electricity and a better way to cook, I know my life would be different. But none of this is likely to happen. Quite simply, I don't have the power to challenge the poverty that I'm in. Now, the sharp people in the room will realise that I'm not actually a 33-year-old Zimbabwean woman. My name's Paul Smith Lomas. I'm the international director of an international development organisation called Practical Action. We work with technology to try and overcome some of the challenges of poverty in the developing world. But Joyce's story is no less real. She's one of 1.5 million people who will lose a child or a relative each year because of diseases associated with inhaling smoke in a smoky kitchen. Usually children, sometimes women, rarely men. She's one of 1.7 million people who don't have access to electricity, and one of 2.7 billion who cook on an open fire, an inefficient, polluting, and dangerous open fire. The link between poverty and access to energy is probably well documented indeed. Vicky gave you some very powerful graphs showing that relationship. And I think perhaps Joyce's story only helps to bring to life some of the limitations of a life without energy. It's tougher than just camping, as I think you've probably heard. Many have argued that access to energy should have been one of the original Millennium Development Goals that were proclaimed nearly 15 years ago now. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why energy has not had the same kind of access to energy, hasn't had the same kind of attention that it might. However, things are changing. This year, the United Nations have declared that this is the year for sustainable energy for all, and they've set a target for energy access for all by the year 2030. And when I say, and it also seems pretty likely that it's going to be declared one of the new Sustainable Development Goals coming out of Rio in the next couple of months. Now, coming from a development organisation as I do, I guess my starting point is really thinking about Joyce, thinking about those 2.7 billion people around the world who don't have access to a clean cook stove, the 1.7 billion who don't have access to electricity. Just a minute, when I say energy access, I don't mean a single solar lantern. I don't mean a light in the clinic. I mean total energy access. I mean energy that allows people light in their home, something to cook with, something to keep things cool, power to charge a communications device, a radio, a mobile phone, as well as the ability to keep things cool, and energy for community services like schools and clinics. I mean total energy. Actually, to meet those total energy access targets by 2030, some people have estimated it's not actually a massive task. Poor people tend to be quite low energy users. Perhaps only 1% additional global energy would help to meet that target of total energy for all. Now, even if you used complete oil-based energy services, it would only add 2% to the global carbon budget and might cost only about $60 billion a year. I don't know why our figures differ, Vicky, but $60 billion a year, representing maybe only 3% of the total money spent on energy in a year. 1, 2, 3, they're pretty small numbers. And indeed, I might further argue that it would be wrong to burden Joyce and those like her with the responsibility that their energy needs to come from sustainable sources. Why? It wasn't them who created the climate chaos that we're living in today. Why should they deal with the hassle? They're not the ones who got us in the mess in the first place. However, those stats, 1, 2, 3, seem to imply that business as usual is going to be fine. But this would be wrong. For many millions of people living in the developing world, especially those living in rural locations, the current approach, mega power stations, grid extensions, are simply not going to deliver. It's not extra finance that they need. They need actually a very different system. If you took those grid extensions and those mega power plants, you would still, by 2030, you would still leave something like 1 billion people without connections to electricity. And you'd probably leave the same 2.5 billion people living and working with a wood stove, an inefficient wood stove. We do need a step change. And sustainable energy sources might actually be a better solution for that step change. Solar, wind and hydropower are by their very nature dispersed across the country. They don't require the massive centralised investment that, with expensive generating grids to reach people who would otherwise be outside of access to electricity. Smart grids, bringing together the various forms of power through hydroelectrics, through solar, through wind, maybe through biomass, can produce a reliable source of energy to meet people's needs, especially those living in rural locations. And this way of thinking is getting increasing amount of credibility, since it addresses not just a cost-effective way of producing energy for those who need it, but also meets global concerns for carbon emissions and recognises the need that we all have to ultimately move away from oil and gas models. Indeed, after some persuasion, the United Nations are now recognising that perhaps as much as half of all new electricity connections are going to be through smart mini-grids and not through major centralised grid extensions. It's interesting. Our organisation's founder, Fritz Schumacher, said, "You should never underestimate the impact of technology on people's lives, not just their standard of living. How they produce, what they produce, where they work, where they live and whom they meet, how they relax or recreate themselves, what they eat, breathe and see, and therefore what they think, their freedom or their dependence." An approach described above would represent not just a significant technological shift, but also represents, excuse the pun, a massive power shift, a shift from a model where major corporations, government-dominated generating stations and grid systems are replaced by thousands of small generating units, which are run by small businesses, individual entrepreneurs, run with, by and for communities. Not only does such a model make good sense for the economy and for the planet, but it also makes good sense for society too. A democratization of power, if you like. Such an approach might allow the developing world to take a leading role in something that, frankly, the developed world is currently struggling with. Gives them the chance, possibly, to leapfrog a technological shift instead of following a path that's been well-trodden and possibly abused by the developed world. It could indeed produce a blueprint for the developed world to follow in due course. I think these are great ideas, which don't necessarily require a huge leap of faith or a huge technological shift, but they do need commitments to make them a reality. It needs policymakers to make those commitments to deliver through on the concept of sustainable energy for all, not just at the global level, but also at nation states. It needs capacities to be built around the world. And when I say capacities, I mean the whole combination of financial institutions, governments, donors, private sector and communities. A recent study by Gates Foundation looking at water and sanitation systems around the world identified that over 70% of all systems developed in the last 5 years are now non-operational. we neglect the ecosystems at our peril. And lastly, financing systems. Financing models need to shift. They need to shift so that the many thousands of small generating stations can be supported instead of the 1 or 2 mega stations. And money, public money, probably needs to be pumped in to finance necessary research and development. So it's not an easy path, but it's something that we at Practical Action will be fighting for over the years to come. It's the kind of exciting prospect, a prospect that people could have the right to use and choose technologies that enables them to lead the kind of lives that they want to live, whilst at the same time not jeopardizing others' ability to similarly make those choices, both for today and in the future. We call this technology justice. And we think the concept of technology justice could be applied not just to energy generation, but also to water and sanitation, to transport, to housing, to agriculture. We believe the concept points the way towards a better world, a world that I think could work well for both the North and the South. I'm sure it's something that Joyce would like to see, and I hope that you would too. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
Yeah, you do the practical action work.
Yes.
The implementation, I remember once in a recent meeting talking about converting or bringing solar power to a town. Well, you can't put any solar in New York State in without tying to the grid. You don't get any public funding. I mean, you can do it, but public work doesn't. You're essentially by law required to tie into the grid.
Okay, right.
So the legal aspect, do you come across that there are hurdles on a legal basis to actually implement?
Mostly our work is focused in rural areas where grid extension is already a non-viable option. So we're starting from a situation where there is no grid and connection is not possible. The thing, if we're fighting for anything, it's for the possibility that as and when grids do advance, and we know that they do and probably will, is then to have adequate feed-in tariffs so that a community that's managing its own solar system or wind system or hydro system actually gets a fair income from the power that's being fed into the grid, as well as obviously the ability to generate their own electricity locally.
Right. So to apply this practically in the United States.
Pass.
Right.
I mean, there's a similar case in France that originally they weren't able to. If you were having, you couldn't have a decentralized energy system. You couldn't generate your own and use your own energy unless you were off grid already, like living somewhere in the Alps. But I think the law has recently changed. So I think it's it's a campaigning at that policy level. If it's really something that would benefit a lot of people, then I guess that's just a policy shift that needs to happen. And unfortunately, because particularly in the developed world, they're so used to, our whole sort of culture is around centralized energy systems. It's very difficult for politicians to see outside that box, and there are sort of problematic barriers like that that may not actually necessarily. Has there been are there campaigns around changing that law, or is it just something that's just a problem? I think it would be worthwhile looking into that.
Well, I might add to this that it's not really a contradiction, the idea of a decentralized energy system in coordination with a widely distributed central managed grid. The Northern Westchester Energy Action Consortium, NWEAC, put a paper out in, I think it was April, that was a proposal to New York State about implementing just that sort of hybrid system, which would involve micro grids, which were each connected to the larger grid through at least 2 points of egress, which would allow for better resilience in the face of power outages. If you go down on one access length, you're still sustained by an access through the other, from the east rather than the west, let's imagine. And with smart grid technology, which is becoming more available and which is going into active testing in Westchester County, where you bring the intelligence down to the neighborhood level so that the neighborhood demand can be aggregated and incentives can be put in place to reduce demand during heat waves and so forth. All of that sort of benefit from the high-tech, high-income countries like the United States can also move in the direction of greater resiliency, lower cost, all of that. So they're not really contradictory. I mean, what these guys have been talking about is mostly zero-grid, developed world sort of technologies, and there's a role for all of those technologies in those places, but we can also do some very interesting things here in the United States.
But actually, and I should disclose the fact that I'm a large-scale solar energy developer. The one thing that I would add to Dr. Johnson's presentation is when we look at the context of a $100 billion feed-in tariff investment globally per year for the next 15 years, over the next 20 years, the global expenditure in the energy category will be 17 or 18 trillion. Now, that's the currency that will be exchanged over business as usual. So, lest it seem, and I'm getting to what this has to do with the decentralized energy question, lest it seem that this ecologically sustainable approach is unaffordable, the truth of the matter is that we've already reached grid parity when we're talking about the developing world, because there is no grid there. So what we're displacing is D2, we're displacing diesel, which has become utterly unaffordable. But in the first world, we're also at grid parity. And Michael has described a somewhat elaborate version of an approach to microgrids working within a central power station distribution scheme. But we're also looking at the fact that because somewhere between 60 and 85% of our electricity is consumed during daylight hours, going to utility scale solar is satisfying that demand in a fully decentralized way in the first world. And we are the grossest energy consumers. If we couple that with demand side measures, that is to say reducing the amount of energy that we use and waste a good deal of, then we're already able to afford the transition based upon the long, reliable asset life of the solar resource, and we're able to afford the capital shift because the solar power has the lowest levelized cost of electricity over the next 40 years. And I'd love to expand on that, but I don't want to take up too much space in the room. I ran next door to find out about the banking solution, so I wanted to rush back here and say that the two are inextricably intertwined. When we move long-term capital out of essentially risky investments like commercial real estate, which are totally unsustainable, and we invest in long asset life generation, then we've solved a great deal of the banking and capital problem and the energy problem with one fell swoop. And so the only encouragement that I would offer is that we have the potential of a multi-trillion-dollar transition that frankly would swamp the feed-in tariff proposal if we only understood how to get the parties together. And that's what we're trying to do in various ways that have been discussed here.
There's a lot of hands on no idea who's Jerry, but just go around. Start with that, we'll go across.
Do you want to say
All right, well, firstly, thank you. I thought that was a terrifically kind of complimentary pair of presentations. And I was keen to invite you to talk a bit more about the political challenges of holding together the climate politics challenge of the energy justice, technology justice kind of challenge. And I guess in doing so, I was keen to get your view on the extent to which even the most rapid of transitions to 100% renewables and an extremely rapid and comprehensive improvement in energy efficiency is sufficient to meet the greenhouse gas reduction targets that we would probably agree are needed to get to at least 2 degrees. So the question, that's in a sense that question is, even with the most rapid of shifts from fossil fuels to renewables and the best possible improvements in energy efficiency. And if that's true, then the other ingredient has to be some kind of reduction in aggregate demand for energy and resources. So that's in a sense the first part of the question. But if you agree with that, I'm really interested to get your views on what that actually means for the politics of this question in, firstly, developed countries like the United States, UK, Australia, and secondly, the politics in China, India, Zimbabwe. And maybe one way to put that question is if you were, I really like the hypothetical kind of approach, if you were in the position of having a leadership position in Zimbabwe or India or China on the one hand, or the US or the UK on the other, how would you argue a just and scientifically informed position that squares that range of challenges?
Big questions. Do you want to, shall I?
Kick off if you like.
So just so I want to clarify what you said. So the first question was about sort of this rapid transition. Can we achieve it in time, basically, and what role does demand management have to play, and then what are the politics of demand management actually saying, all right, guys, this is enough. This enough is enough.
Correct.
So yeah, I mean, in terms of, you're right. Like, I mean, if you look at the kind of how long it would probably take us to transform the energy system from, the sustainable energy for proposal that's going to Rio is calling for a doubling of renewable energy by 2030. That's not enough. It's not enough. Like by 2030, that's just simply not enough. Energy efficiency, yes, we can improve energy efficiency, but there's problems with the rebound effect. So, as you become more efficient, you demand more, and therefore it offsets the reduction. So that's another problem. So that naturally leads you to the question that the only way that energy efficiency actually works by reducing demand is to have demand management and say there's sufficiency. I mean, in terms of the developed world, well, I don't know how it works in the US or elsewhere, but certainly in the UK, it's cheaper for us to use more energy than it is less. So, for example, the first, I can't think what the figures are, but say the first, 10 kilowatt hours that you use of electricity is probably more than that, but say the first 10 kilowatt hours is the most expensive, and then every subsequent kilowatt hour you use is cheaper. That makes no sense. What's the incentive to save money? Like, wouldn't it make more sense to have, you have your 10 kilowatt hour allowance per month, and then everything above that is more expensive? It's just swapping things around. I mean, the energy companies probably wouldn't make any, they wouldn't really necessarily change how much money they make, but it would make absolute sense to change that. And that's one example of demand management, which would be relatively simple. Of course, telling people, you can't have, this is your allowance, this is how much you can have, has cultural problems. In the UK, we talk about quite a lot of environmental campaigns to talk about rationing and linking it to Second World War, and how rationing was actually great in terms of well-being because it put everyone on a level footing and you get rid of all these kind of inequalities. In France, however, rationing has very negative connotations, and they don't want to talk about rationing as a concept. It's just politically unfeasible. So, I mean, I don't know what I think that's a really important question. I mean, just getting a politician to stand up and say, actually, I'm going to limit how much you can have is almost political suicide right now. So I guess it's a kind of a combination of public mood, through campaigning and building a movement, and plus also working with policymakers to realise that actually it's cheaper, it's easier to be energy secure if you're just not using so much energy. I mean, it's a bit of a no-brainer, really.
I'm not sure I can add an enormous amount to what Vicky's already said, but I mean, in terms of sort of China, India, Zimbabwe, they're obviously very different economies in themselves. And I think you can't get away from is the fact that a lot of cities already running on oil and coal, and that's not going to change overnight. But I mean, if I was to have the freedom to invest in money now, I would cease all of the major grid extensions and immediately shift the kind of investments into renewables, You are seeing in South Africa, for example, investment now in large-scale solar generation. And I think the sort of new emerging towns, expanding towns, very easily you can turn those to to sort of a combination, particularly solar wind. Great combinations in countries like Zimbabwe. Hydroelectric power's got enormous potential in various parts of the world. I think we should never forget biomass. Biomass, cooking is a massive component of a lot of people's energy consumption, particularly poor people in the developing world. And there are loads of simple things that we can do with technology to improve the efficiency of cook stoves. It's often neglected because it's not very sexy, but a traditional stove is like 15% efficient. I've got a wood-burning stove in my house which is 75% efficient. That is one heck of a lot of energy that's being wasted that could be turned around, which could turn around not just that the carbon dioxide being pumped out, but reduce all the deforestation associated with those cook stoves. There's an enormous amount that can be done for sure.